Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and also Easton Antique Arms. So in the 1840s there were a number of officers, particularly serving in India, who found that they wanted a hilt that was more protective than the standard 3-bar hilt. And as we've discussed in previous videos, this type of hilt in British service came in as regulation in 1821 for light cavalry. The heavy cavalry did have a bowl guard, which we're going to look at the officer version of in a moment, but lots of branches of cavalry had this 3-bar guard, and whilst it is pretty good as a guard, it does nevertheless leave some gaps and is not the most protective guard you could conceive, obviously. Okay, so particularly in India, serving officers decided that they were going to start buying what I call non-regulation or special regulation weapons. In other words, swords that conformed more or less to the regulations, but in India and in outflung extremities of the empire, they were given more leeway in what equipment they had. And also remember that you could have a sword for parade that met regulations, and you could have a sword for war that didn't necessarily need to meet the regulations, and for this reason we know that lots of British officers in fact carried Indian swords in war, including tulwars. Those of them who were in the heavy cavalry already had a very protective hilt. However, many officers of irregular cavalry, and what that is essentially British officers with locally raised troops, and they were partially equipped by the British government, but also often they were equipped by themselves, so often they would be equipped with tulwars or native swords wherever they were from, but the officers themselves had to equip themselves, and often they were regarded as light cavalry, so they would have had the 3-bar hilt by regulation, so they wanted something else. Now some of them did go for what's known as the ladder hilt, okay, which is sometimes known as a scroll hilt, but that gets confusing, which is the heavy cavalry pattern for heavy cavalry officers. This is actually a horse guard sword, but we'll talk about that another time. It is essentially the same pattern as this for heavy cavalry officers. However, it seems that some of them didn't want to just go for the heavy cavalry officers hilt because they weren't heavy cavalry, and I suppose they wanted to be different. Individualism is strong, especially amongst British officers serving in India, who like to be different. And so they came up with a type of hilt that was similar to the heavy cavalry officer's hilt, that we often now know, some people call it the scroll hilt, which confuses it with the other hilt, but what it seems that certainly in the 1840s it was known as by Wilkinson Sword was the Sind pattern, or the Sind irregular cavalry pattern hilt. Now, why was it called that? Well, because very simply, John Jacobs of the Sind irregular cavalry, a lot of his officers seem to have ordered this particular pattern of hilt, and it looks like this. And I think it's pretty much the most beautiful hilt that, to my eyes, to my tastes, that any British sword has had. At least, except for maybe a few one-offs, but I think as a more or less standard pattern, it's beautiful. And it's essentially acanthus leaves scrolling all over the guard. Now if we just look at the silhouette of the guard for a minute, the silhouette of the sabre guard is actually no different really to the bowl of a heavy cavalry trooper's sword or certain types of cutlass hilt. Okay, it protects mostly the back of the hand, but it also protects the thumb side as well, and it covers all of this area. And what they've done is they've simply perforated that bowl, they've perforated that piece of steel with patterns that end up giving you this scrolling leaf pattern. There we go. And you'll also notice that incorporated in that at the end is a slot for the sword knot to tie it, to secure it to your wrist, so if you drop the weapon it dangles off your wrist and isn't dropped on the ground. Now the early ones of these were steel, just like this, and in the Wilkinson pattern book they are labelled as the Sind irregular cavalry hilt, and it seems that in the 1840s this type of hilt was known as essentially being for Indian officers, or for British officers in India, and not to say that they all had it, and it was never a standard pattern. However, it did become to some degree popular, and I do own a couple of other examples of this steel type. However, by the 1850s, when it was still in use, there came a time when the Royal Engineers wanted to have their own sword pattern, and up until that point they had used the standard, let's grab one, they had used the standard infantry style hilt, okay, which traditionally was made of brass, and up until up until 1857, but up until about between 1856 and 1858, they were still using the infantry model of sword. However, in 1857, they decided, okay, we're the Royal Engineers, we've done some really cool stuff, we want to have our own model of sword, and it was agreed at Horse Guards, and so they decided to give them their own model of hilt in 1857, and what did they choose to copy? That's right, they chose to copy the type of hilt that had become popular for fighting officers in India. They'd copied the Sind Irregular Cavalry hilt. So what I have here is an 1857 pattern Royal Engineers sword, and that's what they look like. The blades are exactly the same as the infantry officers' blades. It's the 1845 type blade, sized for someone on foot, so it's 32.5 or 33 inches in length, usually. You sometimes get longer ones, but usually that's the standard length, the regulation length. The only real difference in the blade to the infantry officer's sword is that the etching is different. The etching on the blade shows the symbols of the Royal Engineers rather than the standard infantry decoration. But the hilt is entirely different now to the infantry officer's sword, and that is officially in 1857 that transition. So if you were in the if you were an officer in the Royal Engineers before 1857, you had an infantry officer's sword. After 1857 until the 1890s or 1900, you had one of these. And they're very, very nice hilts, and it's not just simply a question of the guard being replicated, but important to note that the guard was replicated in brass. Brass is obviously not as tough as steel, but it's easier to make and easier to cast because it's cast. Okay, so you can make a mould for this style of guard, and you can cast lots of these hilts. With the steel ones, they have to be handmade, every individual one, so they're much more laborious. So they went with the brass hilt, not as protective, but it will still protect you against most cuts. It might get damaged, but your hand's not going to get cut up so long as the cuts land on that. But there are a couple of other differences about the hilt as well. Firstly, that they pretty much universally, all the ones I've ever seen anyway, all have the checkered thumb piece, and that is of course to for your thumb to have a good grip against when you're holding it with the thumb up grip, whether you're thrusting or whether you're doing it all the time. That had been in use on many swords from the 1840s, but it was never completely regulation. You get it on some swords and you don't get it on other swords. On the Royal Engineers swords, as far as I've seen, you always get it. Okay, so you always have the checkered backstrap on the Royal Engineers sword, and curiously, you pretty much always, I have seen ones without, but you like 90% of the time get a checkered pommel. Now the checkered pommel is an interesting feature. Again, much like the checkered backstrap here, we do find the checkered pommel on swords going back to the 1840s, perhaps even into the 1830s, but definitely into the 1840s, and often on these non-regulation officers serving in India or wherever. So it seems like it came up as a thing in a similar kind of environment to the Sind Irregular Cavalry hilt, the idea of having checkered pommels. Surprisingly, perhaps, we don't know why they had checkered pommels. They don't seem to serve any real purpose. And there's been much debate, whatever theories you can think of as to why the pommel might be checkered, they've all been thought of before. Yes, it might make it better for hitting people with. Yes, it might aid grip somehow, but why would it be on the pommel? We don't grip the pommel really. There's all sorts of possible theories, but we just don't really know why they checkered the pommel. It could simply be because they liked the look of it. Maybe because the checkering of the backstrap was a new thing, so that looked, oh, new, funky and modern. Let's do some more of that up here, because it looks nice. It just could be as simple as that. We don't know. But there we go, so 1857, Royal Engineers, but also Indian Engineers, so the Bombay Engineers, Bengal Engineers, all branches of the British Engineers had officers had this Star of Guard in brass after 1857, and it wasn't replaced until nearly the end of the century. Now, one final thing to mention about the Royal Engineers hilt is that it was brass. Now, in 1852, John Latham, who was the guy who by that point owned and ran Wilkinson Sword Company, gave an excellent lecture, which you can find actually on Google Books in its full transcribed form. And he says that he thinks of the British swords available, the best sword hilt, the most protective hilt, is the 1857 hilt. He said that this is the most protective hilt and the one that he would recommend really pretty much for all swords, and I agree. However, he does point out that the Engineers one is made of brass, which is not so good, which is true. A steel one's better, and equally he mentions that it's not symmetrical, and a symmetrical guard is better from a swordsmanship point of view because it means you've got a better balance to the sword. It has a better feeling in the hand. It's less likely to turn in the hand. So as you'll notice, it always protrudes more on the meat of your hand, the knuckle side, more than on the thumb side, which is pretty standard and it makes them more comfortable to wear. However, ideally you'd make the guard the same width on both sides. However, that's a fairly minor quibble because it's still got a fair amount of width on the inside. But what he did note, as I mentioned, was that obviously steel is better than brass for a sword hilt because it's more protective, it's tougher, stronger. Now what's interesting is that what I'm holding here, although it looks identical to an earlier, an 1840s should we say, or early 1850s Indian officer's sword, this is actually a Royal Engineers officer's sword, but it has a steel hilt. So what the owner, and I do know who the person who bought this sword was, and he was quite a special officer, and I'll do a video just about him in the future because he was quite historically significant, but he obviously had strong opinions about swords and wanted a hardcore sword, a good sword, and so he went, okay, well I'm in the Royal Engineers, so I will get a Royal Engineers sword, but instead of having a brass hilt I will have a steel hilt because it's tougher. Now I suspect that originally this was gilded so that it looked the same colour as the normal Royal Engineers sword hilt, so although it was steel it probably looked gold in colour. And supporting that hypothesis, we have this sword, which is yet again a Royal Engineers sword hilt with a Sind irregular cavalry pattern hilt, beautiful thing that it is, but it ain't brass. Although it looks gold in colour, it's actually gilded, and this is a steel hilt. This is yet another Wilkinson, and this one is also a patent hilt as well, but I'll talk about patent hilts in another video. But this is yet another Royal Engineers sword, and just feast your eyes on that hilt. God, I love that. The detail, every leaf, as well as the guard being cut out of steel by hand, every leaf has had decoration carved into the steel on it. There we go, look at that. And not only has it had that decoration etched into the, not etched, sorry, engraved into the surface with a chisel by hand, but the steel has then been gilded, in other words covered with gold leaf, so that it looks the right colour for a Royal Engineer officer. So it looks like brass, hilariously. So there we go guys, the Sind irregular cavalry hilt had a long and rich history that started out from essentially officers in India fighting rebellious tribes and fighting small wars, fighting in the Sikh wars and such like, and feeling that they wanted a more protective hilt for their hand, and some of them wore gauntlets, it should be mentioned. They actually had chainmail gauntlets in the 19th century that were used occasionally for either hand or both hands, and so they came up with this hilt design, probably in conjunction with a company like Wilkinson. We don't know exactly how it was designed at the beginning. Wilkinson knew this hilt as the Sind irregular cavalry hilt in the 1840s and 50s, and then in 1857 the Royal Engineers, who were highly respected because they were very educated and of course had to be able to do maths very well, and because they had to be able to build bridges and fortifications and explode things, and they were very clever chaps, pretty much the cleverest chaps in the army actually. The Royal Engineers said, we want a special sword because we're special, and so what did they get? They got the cinder regular cavalry hilt, and that went all the way through to nearly 1900 as retained as a hilt design, and some special officers, or officers who regarded themselves as special at least, bought special swords where they went, I want this special sword, but instead of the normal special brass guard, I want an even more special steel guard that is gilded, so it's the right colour but it's tougher. So an interesting bit of British sword history. Cheers guys! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.